Arizona Territory, winter 1887. The wind was a thief. It came down from the Mogollon Rim with a high, thin scream, stealing the heat from a man's bones and the trail from under his horse's hooves. It carried sand, not in gentle whispers, but in a solid, grinding sheet that scoured the world down to its raw, red skeleton. In the space of a single afternoon, the landscape had been rewritten, its familiar paths erased, its promises of direction turned into lies. The sun, a pale and sickly disk, had already surrendered, sinking behind the churning wall of dust. Eliza Calder felt the theft in her marrow. Each gust was a physical blow, forcing the air from her lungs and pushing her deeper into the inadequate shelter of her wool coat. Her horse, a sturdy Morgan named Atlas, trembled beneath her, his head low against the onslaught. One of her hands, wrapped tight in the reins, was numb. The other clutched a leather-bound sketchbook to her chest as if it were the last anchor in a world dissolving around her. It was, in a way. Inside were the charcoal lines and watercolor washes of a world she understood, a world of ordered beauty from back east. This was chaos. This was a godless expanse of rock and wind that had no patience for art, or for a woman who had foolishly believed the wagon-trained scout when he'd said the path to Copper Vale was a simple day's ride ahead. They'd promised to wait. They hadn't. She had been following the deep ruts of their wheels, but the wind had filled them, smoothed them over, leaving her with nothing but the vast, howling emptiness. Every rock formation looked the same, every twisted juniper a mocking silhouette of the last. Panic was a cold knot in her stomach, a sensation she fought with the stubborn practicality that had brought her this far west. She was an artist, yes, but she was not a fragile doll. She had come to paint the truth of this land, and if this was its truth, then she would face it. "Easy, Atlas," she murmured, her voice stolen and shredded by the wind. "Just a little further. We'll find shelter." The horse snorted, a plume of hot breath instantly snatched away. He trusted her, and the weight of that trust was heavier than the pack on his back. The terrain forced them downwards, into a shallow wash that offered a brief respite from the direct assault of the wind. The air was still thick with grit, but at least here the roar was muffled. The pressure lessened. The floor of the wash was a mix of sand and loose rock, and Atlas picked his way with careful, weary steps. Eliza scanned the rising walls of the canyon, searching for an overhang, a cleft, anything that could serve as a shield against the storm. It was getting dark fast, the light fading not into a gentle twilight but being smothered by the suffocating blanket of dust. That's when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. This was a different sound, a deeper sound that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself, a low, grinding rumble, punctuated by a sharp, cracking retort like a giant bone snapping. Atlas's ears swiveled, his body going rigid. Eliza pulled back on the reins, her own heart suddenly pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The ground beneath them seemed to hum, a vibration that traveled up through the horse's legs and into her own. She looked up the canyon, into the gloom. There was a darkness there that was not of the dying light, a moving, churning darkness. Before her mind could fully process the sight, her ears understood. It was the sound of water, a furious, hungry sound, mixed with the percussive crash of rolling boulders. A flash flood. The words barely formed in her mind before the monster was upon them. A wall of brown water, thick as syrup and choked with debris, uprooted sagebrush, splintered branches, and stones the size of a man's head came surging down the narrow channel. It wasn't a river. It was a battering ram of liquid earth. Atlas screamed, a sound of pure terror, and tried to rear, to scramble up the steep, crumbling bank, but the mud was already there, a thick, viscous ooze that came with the vanguard of the flood. It sucked at his hooves, pulling him down. The water hit them not as a wave but as a solid, violent shove. Eliza was nearly unseated, the icy shock of the water soaking through her skirts and boots in an instant. The current was immense, a force of raw, unstoppable nature. It spun them, pulling Atlas off his feet. He struggled, his powerful legs churning uselessly in the thick slurry. The water was rising with terrifying speed, already up to Eliza's knees as she sat in the saddle. She could feel the horse's panic, his straining muscles, his fight for purchase. The mud had him. It was like quicksand, a greedy maw pulling them under. Her sketchbook, her precious anchor, slipped from her grasp and was gone, swallowed by the brown torrent. A cry of loss was ripped from her throat, but it was a small sound against the roar. Survival took over. She had to get off the horse, get to the bank. She threw a leg over the saddle, pushing herself away from the struggling animal, her feet plunging into the freezing, pulling muck. The current immediately grabbed her, dragging her downstream. She clawed at the canyon wall, her gloved fingers finding no purchase on the slick, sandy rock. For a terrifying moment, she was submerged, the gritty water filling her mouth and nose. She fought her way back to the surface, gasping, spitting mud, her heavy, waterlogged skirts a dead weight trying to drown her. Then, through the chaos and the roaring, she saw him. He was on the edge of the wash, standing on a shelf of rock just above the floodline, as still as the stone he stood upon. He seemed not to have appeared, but to have simply emerged from the landscape itself, a natural feature she hadn't noticed before. He was Apache. That much was clear from his high cheekboned face, the dark, straight hair held back by a simple band, and the unadorned buckskin he wore. He held a bow in one hand and a small bundle of firewood in the other, as if he had been merely out for a walk and had stumbled upon this scene of violent turmoil. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes taking in the struggling horse, the churning water, and her own desperate fight. There was no surprise in his face, no alarm, only a deep, unnerving calm. For a heartbeat, Eliza thought he would just watch her die, another piece of the uncaring landscape, observing the brief, frantic struggle of a creature out of its element. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she lunged for the bank. Her fingers scraped against rock, and for a second, she thought she had it. But the bank was all loose scree and wet sand. It crumbled under her weight. She began to slide back, down toward the deeper, faster part of the channel where Atlas was now being swept away, his desperate cries fading into the storm. As she slid, her shoulder slammed into a sharp outcropping of rock hidden beneath the muddy water. A hot, searing pain shot through her, and she heard the sound of her dress tearing. She was losing. The cold was sapping her strength, the current was too strong, and the bank was a traitor. She was going to be washed away, battered against the rocks and buried in the silt. Just as her grip failed completely, a hand closed around her wrist. It was not a gentle grasp. It was hard and unyielding, the grip of a man whose strength was a practical tool, not a display. He pulled, and it was like being hoisted by a crane. She was lifted from the water's greedy clutch, her boots making a sucking sound as they came free of the mud. He hauled her up onto the narrow ledge beside him in a single, fluid motion. She lay there for a moment, coughing up muddy water, shivering violently, the world a dizzying blur of brown water and gray sky. The pain in her shoulder was a sharp, steady throb. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, looking at her rescuer. He was already moving. He didn't speak, didn't even look at her. He dropped his firewood and bow and knelt beside her. His eyes went to her torn sleeve, where a dark stain was already spreading. Without a word of permission, he took the shredded fabric of her dress and, with a quick, efficient twist, knotted it tightly above the wound, creating a makeshift pressure bandage. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his movements were precise. Then, before she could protest or even fully comprehend, he had scooped her into his arms. One arm went under her knees, the other securely around her back. The sudden intimacy was shocking, but it was devoid of any tenderness. It was pure function. She was a thing to be moved, a package to be transported from a place of danger to one of safety. He held her easily, his lean frame belying a strength that was as solid as the rock around them. He moved along the ledge, his moccasined feet finding sure holds on the treacherous surface. He moved with a grace that was almost animal, a complete and silent confidence in his own body and his knowledge of the terrain. He didn't seem to be fighting the storm. He seemed to be a part of it. moving within its chaos without being touched by it. He was a shadow slipping through the flood. He navigated a narrow, almost invisible path upwards, away from the roaring water, until they reached a dark opening in the canyon wall, a shallow cave, its floor dry and sandy. He set her down gently inside, then turned and went back to the ledge to retrieve his bow and the bundle of wood. When he returned, the cave seemed to shrink, filled by his silent presence. The world outside was a symphony of destruction, the roar of the flood, the shriek of the wind, and the periodic gut-wrenching groan of rock and earth giving way somewhere up the canyon. But inside the cave, there was a sudden, profound stillness. The air was cold, but it was still. Eliza huddled against the far wall, her body racked with shivers that were only partly from the cold. Shock was setting in, and a deep, aching grief for Atlas. She pulled her torn, soaked clothes tighter around herself, the pain in her shoulder a sharp, constant reminder of how close she had come to the end. The Apache man ignored her. He was focused on the task at hand. He knelt in the center of the cave floor and unwrapped his bundle of wood. It was mostly pine bark, damp on the outside but likely drier within. He shaved off thin slivers with a small, sharp knife he produced from a sheath at his belt. He worked with an economy of motion, his hands never fumbling, his focus absolute. He built a small, careful pile of the driest tinder, shielded it with his body, and then produced a fire-starting kit. In the dim light, Eliza couldn't see it clearly, but she heard the scrape of flint on steel. A spark, another. Then a tiny ember glowed in the heart of the tinder. He blew on it, a soft, controlled breath, coaxing it to life. A wisp of smoke, thin and gray, curled up towards the cave ceiling. It was the most beautiful thing Eliza had ever seen. The smoke carried the sharp, clean scent of pine, and it was the first scent that wasn't of mud and wet decay. It was the smell of hope. A tiny flame flickered, fragile and yellow. He fed it patiently, adding larger slivers of bark, then small twigs, until a small but steady fire was crackling in the center of the cave. The light pushed back the oppressive gloom, casting their shadows, long and dancing, against the rock walls. And then came the warmth. It was a slow, creeping thing at first, a ghost of heat against her frozen skin. But it was real. The man sat back on his heels, watching the flames, his face a mask of stoic concentration, etched by the firelight. He seemed to be listening, not to her, but to the storm, to the fire, to the mountain itself. Eliza finally found her voice. It was a hoarse, broken thing, barely a whisper. "Thank you." He didn't turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on the fire, as if all the answers in the world were held within its dance. For a long moment, she thought he hadn't heard her, or wouldn't answer. Then, his voice came, low and rough, as elemental as the stone around them. "Live first, talk later." The words were not unkind, but they were not gentle either. They were a statement of fact, a law of this harsh, unforgiving place. Survival was the only currency that mattered here. Everything else was a luxury. Outside, a fresh section of the canyon wall gave way with a deafening crash, sending a tremor through the floor of their small sanctuary. Eliza flinched, her eyes wide with fear. The man didn't move. In the sudden quiet that followed the rockfall, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the distant howl of the wind, and, if she held her breath and listened very carefully, the frantic, unsteady beat of her own heart. Sometimes, in the lulls, she thought she could hear his too, a slow, steady rhythm, as calm and certain as the turning of the earth. Morning broke not with light, but with a change in the sound of the world. The deep-throated roar of the flood had subsided into a gurgling, sucking whisper. The percussive violence of the wind had ceased, but in its place came a new sound, a high, thin keening that seemed to slice through the rock itself. The direction of the wind had shifted, now pouring directly from the north, and it carried not sand, but a profound and predatory cold. Eliza woke to it. The cold was a physical presence in the cave, a beast that had crept in while she slept. Her sleep had been a shallow, shivering thing, haunted by the thunder of falling rock and the terror of the churning water. Now, in the gray pre-dawn light, she saw that the fire had been fed through the night, a small, determined heart of embers glowing in a bed of ash. The man was not there. A knot of fear, cold as the air itself, tightened in her stomach. Had he left her? The thought was absurd. He had saved her life, but the desolation of her circumstance made it terrifyingly plausible. She was a stranger here, a liability. She pushed herself up, every muscle screaming in protest. Her clothes were stiff and still damp, clinging to her skin like a shroud of ice. The pain in her shoulder was a dull, heavy ache, a constant companion. She crawled to the mouth of the cave and looked out. The world had been remade. The wash below was a treacherous expanse of slick, brown mud and stranded debris. The water had receded, leaving a small, swift channel of brown water running down the center. On the far side, the rocks were glazed with a thin, clear coating of ice, sparkling with a cruel beauty in the flat light. The air was so cold it burned in her lungs, each breath a painful act. Then she saw him. He was standing on a high ledge a little way down the canyon, as still as a heron, looking out over the scoured landscape. He was studying the world as a scholar studies a text, reading its new and dangerous grammar. He seemed immune to the cold, wearing the same buckskins as before, his posture relaxed, patient. Seeing him there, a solid, living form in the vast, frozen emptiness, loosened the knot of fear in her chest, though she could not have said why. He must have felt her eyes on him, for he turned his head and looked directly at her. His gaze was unnerving, not because it was hostile, but because it was so utterly neutral. It held no judgment, no pity, no curiosity. It simply was. After a moment, he turned and began making his way back towards the cave with the same silent, unnerving grace. When he entered, he brought the sharp, clean scent of the cold with him. He carried a few pieces of dry, resinous wood, which he added carefully to the fire, coaxing the flames back to a brighter life. He didn't speak. He moved to where she sat huddled, and his dark eyes went to her shoulder. The makeshift bandage was soaked through with a mixture of muddy water and blood. He knelt in front of her. For the first time, she saw him clearly in the growing light. His face was all sharp angles and planes, a face carved by the wind and the sun. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from long years of squinting into the glare of the desert. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps close to her own age, but he carried an ancient stillness about him. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the knotted fabric. The instinct was immediate, a reflex born of a world away, a world of locked doors and formal introductions. "Don't touch me," she said. The words were quiet, but sharp with an edge of panicked defiance. His hand stopped instantly, a mere inch from her arm. He did not pull back in surprise or offense. He simply froze, his gaze meeting hers. The moment stretched, filled with the whistling of the wind outside and the crackle of the growing fire. He was looking at her, really looking at her. And she felt a sudden, strange sense of being utterly transparent, as if he could see the fear and the exhaustion and the stubborn, foolish pride warring within her. His gaze dropped. He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and took something out. It was another, smaller pouch, this one of soft, worn deerskin. He placed it on the sandy ground in the space between them. He did not push it towards her or offer it. He simply set it down. Then he sat back on his heels. The gesture was unmistakable. A boundary had been drawn. The help was there, but it would not be forced upon her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of her choice. To accept his help was to admit her own complete helplessness. To refuse was an act of suicidal pride. The throbbing in her shoulder seemed to grow stronger, a painful argument against her own stubbornness. She looked from his unreadable face to the pouch on the ground. She looked down at her own hands, pale and trembling slightly. They were an artist's hands, made for the delicate work of charcoal and brush. not for tending to a ragged wound in the heart of a wilderness. She was a fool. Her eyes met his again. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He accepted it with the same stillness, as if he had known what her choice would be all along. He moved closer, and this time she did not flinch, with deft, impersonal movements. He untied the sodden knot and gently peeled the torn fabric away from her skin. Eliza had to bite her lip to keep from crying out as the cloth pulled at the raw flesh. The wound was ugly, a long, deep gash running from her collarbone down over the curve of her shoulder, inflamed and weeping. The edges were ragged, and embedded in the flesh were tiny, dark splinters of rock. He examined it with a clinical detachment, his touch surprisingly light. He rose and went to a corner of the cave, returning with a small, hollowed-out stone bowl. He took a water skin from his belt and poured a small amount of water into it, setting it near the fire to warm. Then he opened the deerskin pouch. The scent that rose from it was sharp and medicinal, earthy and green. He emptied the contents onto a flat rock, a handful of dried, feathery leaves, a lump of amber-colored pine resin, and a small quantity of fine gray ash. Using another smooth, rounded stone, he began to grind the dried leaves into a coarse powder. He worked with a patient, rhythmic motion, his hands sure and steady. They were hard, calloused hands, the knuckles scarred, the palms scored with a life of difficult work. But there was a deep competence in them, a knowledge that went beyond thought. Watching him, Eliza began to understand. His silence was not coldness. It was a form of deep and abiding caution, the quiet of a man who lives in a world where a single misplaced step or a single careless word could mean the difference between life and death. His stillness was not emptiness. It was a reservoir of focused energy. He mixed the powdered leaves with the sage ash, then scraped the sticky pine resin into the mixture, working it with his fingertips until it formed a thick, dark paste. The cave filled with the pungent, clean aroma. When the water in the stone bowl was warm, he took a strip of clean cloth from his pouch and dipped it in. Gently, methodically, he began to clean the wound. The pain was excruciating. Each touch sent a fresh wave of fire through her shoulder. She clenched her jaw, her nails digging into her palms. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful, and she turned her head away, determined not to make a sound. She would not give him that. She did not know why it was so important, only that it was. He worked without pause, his breath a soft, steady rhythm beside her. He used the sharp point of his knife to carefully, painstakingly, pick out each tiny rock splinter. The precision of the work was astonishing. When he was finally done, he took a thick dollop of the dark poultice on his fingers and spread it over the entire length of the wound. It was cool at first, then began to tingle, a strange, drawing sensation that seemed to pull the fire and pain out of the flesh. He covered the poultice with a fresh pad of soft moss and bound the whole thing firmly in place with a clean strip of buckskin. The work was done. He sat back, his face impassive as ever. The relief was so intense it left her feeling lightheaded. The sharp, tearing pain had been replaced by a dull, manageable throb. In the quiet, she felt the need to fill the space, to re-establish some semblance of the world she knew, a world of names and polite exchanges. "Name?" she asked, her voice raspy. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to weigh the question. "Taji," he said. The name was short, guttural, like a stone striking stone. "Eliza," she offered in return. The two names hung in the warm air between them, fragile and strange. They weren't an introduction. They were a treaty, a temporary promise of shared existence in this small, firelit space. Taji rose and went to the cave entrance. He studied the sky, the direction of the wind, the feel of the air. When he turned back, his face was grave. "Do not leave the cave," he said. His English was slow, deliberate, each word chosen with care, not when the wind sounds like a flute. She followed his gaze. The wind was no longer a high, slicing keen. It was a lower, more musical sound, a hollow, whistling moan as it passed over the sharp edges of the rocks. It was a beautiful and deeply menacing sound. She nodded her understanding. It was a simple rule, the first law of their new, two-person world. For the rest of the day, they existed in a state of shared silence. Tazi worked, sharpening his knife, restringing his bow, checking his arrows. Every action was precise, purposeful, with no wasted energy. Eliza watched him, her exhaustion a heavy blanket. She was an observer, a painter without her tools. The urge to capture him on paper was a physical ache, the sharp line of his jaw, the way the firelight caught the black sheen of his hair, the absolute focus in his eyes. But her sketchbook was gone, lost to the flood, and the loss felt like an amputation. Late in the afternoon, the whistling of the wind died down. A heavy, frozen stillness fell over the canyon, and in that stillness, Eliza saw it, a flash of white and brown snagged on the branches of a half-submerged juniper tree not 20 yards from the cave. It was wedged firmly, held just out of the main current. Her sketchbook. Her heart gave a painful lurch. It was waterlogged, certainly ruined, but it was there. It was a piece of her life before the storm, and she could not bear to leave it. Taji was at the back of the cave, sorting through his small pack. She glanced at him, then back at the book. The wind was quiet. The rule was about the whistling. This was different. It was a calculated risk, but one she had to take. Moving as quietly as she could, she got to her feet. Her shoulder protested with a sharp twinge, but she ignored it. She slipped out of the cave, her worn boots making no sound on the sandy ground. The cold was a solid shock, but her mind was fixed on her goal. The ground leading down to the water's edge was a treacherous slope of slick, half-frozen mud. She picked her way down carefully, her arms out for balance. The juniper was further than it looked. She had to wade into the shallows to reach it, the icy water instantly soaking her boots and the hem of her skirt, burning against her skin. Her fingers closed around the wet, swollen leather of the sketchbook. A wave of relief, so profound it almost made her dizzy, washed over her. She had it. She began to pull it free from the branches. But the mud had other ideas. As she shifted her weight to pull, the ground under her right foot gave way. It wasn't a slow slide. It was a sudden, sickening lurch. She was plunged into the water up to her waist. The current, far stronger than it looked, grabbing at her skirts, pulling her off balance. She lost her footing completely, her other foot slipping in the greedy ooze. With a cry of alarm, she fell backwards into the frigid, fast-moving channel. The shock of the cold was paralyzing, stealing her breath. The current seized her, pulling her downstream. Her head went under. Panic, cold and absolute, exploded in her chest. Then, once again, a hand clamped onto her arm like a vice. Tazi was there, standing on the bank she had just slid from, his feet planted as if he were rooted to the stone. He must have followed her, silent as a ghost. He hauled her out of the water with a single, furious pull, dragging her up the muddy bank and back into the relative safety of the cave. He deposited her on the ground next to the fire, a dripping, shivering, muddy heap. She still clutched the sketchbook to her chest. He stood over her, his chest rising and falling, and for the first time, she saw something other than stillness in his face. It was not quite anger. It was a kind of cold, hard exasperation, the look of a man whose patience had been pushed to its absolute limit. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was a condemnation, more potent than any words. Shame washed over her, hot and bitter. She had been a fool, a child, risking both their lives for a book of drawings. He turned away from her, a gesture of dismissal, and began to build up the fire, his movements sharp and angry. The flames leaped higher, their warmth a welcome blessing, their light a cruel witness. In the brighter light, her torn dress was even more revealing. The gash in the fabric was wide, exposing the pale skin of her shoulder and collarbone, stark against the dark, wet wool. She saw Tazi's eyes flicker towards it for a brief second before he deliberately turned his back to her, facing the far wall of the cave. He presented her with nothing but the rigid line of his shoulders. The gesture was one of profound, almost courtly, respect, a granting of privacy where none existed. Her cheeks flushed with heat. With a shaking hand, she reached for the dry blanket he had used the night before and pulled it tight around her shoulders, hiding herself. She was blushing, humiliated, but a small, stubborn part of her refused to feel weak. She had made a mistake, a terrible one, but she had retrieved a part of herself. Night fell, a deep, starless black. The cold intensified. They ate in silence strips of dried meat from his pouch, tough and salty, but life-sustaining. The silence in the cave was different now. It was no longer a space of shared survival. It was stretched taut with her folly, and his quiet contained anger. Later, as the fire burned low, Tazi did something strange. He took a small, fragrant bough of pine from his bundle of wood and placed it on the glowing embers. A thick, aromatic smoke billowed up, filling the small space with its clean, sacred scent. He sat before the fire, his head bowed, and began to speak in a low, murmuring voice. It was not English. It was his own language, a rhythmic, chanting sound that was less a conversation and more a prayer. He was speaking to the smoke, to the fire, to the spirits of the canyon. Eliza watched him, mesmerized. The anger seemed to have left him, replaced by a deep and solemn sorrow. The ritual was intensely private, and she felt like an intruder, but she could not look away. When he finally fell silent, the question came out before she could stop it. A small, hesitant whisper. What are you doing?" Taji did not turn to look at her. He kept his eyes on the plume of smoke as it rose, straight and true in the still air, carrying his words up into the darkness. "Smoke," he said, his voice low and distant, "carries the word. The fever came in the night. It was a sly, insidious thing, creeping into her veins while the cold gnawed at her from the outside." Eliza drifted in and out of a restless sleep, her dreams a chaotic replay of the flood, of Atlas's terrified eyes, of the grinding roar of the water. When she finally surfaced to a state of groggy awareness, the cave was filled with the same flat, gray light as the day before. But the world felt different. It felt wrong. A deep, malevolent heat was radiating from her shoulder, a sickening warmth that had nothing to do with the small, steady fire Tazi was tending. The ache was no longer a clean, sharp pain. It had become a heavy, pulsating throb that seemed to beat in time with her own feverish heart. She shifted, and a jolt of agony, white-hot and vicious, shot through her, making her gasp. Taji's head came up, his dark eyes instantly alert, missing nothing. He watched her for a moment, his expression as unreadable as ever, before returning his attention to the sliver of dried meat he was carefully slicing with his knife. He offered her a piece, holding it out on the flat of the blade. The thought of food turned her stomach. She shook her head, a small, weak gesture. She had to see the wound. With her good hand, she fumbled with the buckskin tie that held the bandage in place. Her fingers were clumsy, shaking with a tremor she couldn't control. The knot was tight and unfamiliar. After several frustrating attempts, she managed to loosen it. The moss dressing, damp and discolored, fell away. She peeled back the buckskin, her breath catching in her throat. The skin around the gash was an angry, swollen red, stretched tight and shiny. The edges of the wound, which had been clean the day before, were now weeping a thin, yellowish fluid that mingled with fresh blood. The fall into the filthy, stagnant water after the flood, a moment of foolish pride to retrieve her sketchbook, had cost her dearly. The wound was festering. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over her. She knew what this meant. She had seen it before on the long journey west, a small cut, ignored or poorly tended, turning into a raging infection that could steal a limb or a life. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of the fever. She had to clean it. She had to do it herself. She looked at Taji. He was watching her again, his work forgotten, his knife still in his hand. He knew. Of course he knew. He knew the language of this land, and that included the language of decay. of a body turning against itself, but he made no move to help. He sat on his heels, a silent, waiting presence, respecting the boundary she herself had so sharply drawn. Don't touch me. Stubbornness was a hard habit to break. It was the armor she had worn her whole life, the shell that protected the soft, vulnerable parts of her. She would not be a helpless female, a burden to this silent, competent man. She would tend to her own wounds. She reached for the water skin in the stone bowl, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She managed to pour some water into the bowl, sloshing half of it onto the sandy floor. She placed it near the fire to warm, her hand trembling so badly the bowl rattled against the rock. Using a strip of her own petticoat, she tried to clean the wound, but the angle was wrong. She couldn't reach it properly, couldn't see what she was doing. Each touch, no matter how gentle, sent a fresh bolt of agony through her. The shaking in her hand made it impossible to be precise. She was only smearing the filth around, agitating the raw flesh until tears of pain and frustration streamed down her face. She gritted her teeth, a low sound of pure misery escaping her lips. It was hopeless. She couldn't do it. She slumped back against the cave wall, defeated. The strip of cloth fell from her nerveless fingers. The armor of her pride had shattered, leaving her exposed, terrified, and utterly alone. She looked at the wound, then at her own shaking, useless hands, and then, finally, she looked at him. Her eyes met his across the small fire. She tried to speak, but her throat was tight with unshed tears. She looked away, at the flickering flames, at the solid, unyielding rock of the cave wall, anywhere but at his face. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He did not move, did not speak. He simply waited. He was giving her the dignity of her own choice. Even now. Finally. She drew a ragged breath. She forced herself to look at him again, to meet that calm, dark gaze that seemed to see right through her. The words were the hardest she had ever spoken, dragged up from a place of absolute surrender. "Please, help me." The whisper was barely audible above the crackle of the fire, but in the stillness of the cave, it landed with the force of a shout. For the first time, Taji's composure seemed to break. He didn't move, but a flicker of something surprise. Confusion passed through his eyes. He stilled, his body going rigid. The physical boundary, the invisible wall they had both acknowledged, was being deliberately dismantled by the very person who had built it. "Wait," he said, his voice low and strained. "What are you doing?" The question was not an accusation. It was one of genuine bewilderment. He did not understand. In his world, a line once drawn was not so easily erased. A request of this magnitude, an invitation to touch, to tend, was a thing of immense weight. He was asking her if she understood the significance of what she was asking. She could not hold his gaze. She looked down at her lap, at her trembling hands. A hot blush, born of shame and a desperate, burgeoning trust, spread up her neck and across her cheeks. She was handing him her vulnerability, her very life, and the enormity of the act was overwhelming. I need you," she whispered to the floor. The words were an echo of her earlier plea, but they held a different resonance now. It was no longer just a request for aid. It was a confession, an admission of dependence. It was an offering of trust, fragile and uncertain, but absolute. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of waiting, but of consideration. He was weighing her words, her tone, the flush on her skin. He was deciding. She kept her head bowed, her heart hammering against her ribs, half expecting him to refuse, to tell her that she had made her choice, and now she must live with it. She heard a faint scraping sound, risking a glance from beneath her lashes. She saw that he had turned his face away from her, towards the solid wall of the cave. He lifted his hand and gently, deliberately, knocked his knuckles against the cold, rough stone. Once, twice. It was not a random gesture. It was a ritual. It was a soft, formal rap on a door that wasn't there. He was asking permission to enter her space, acknowledging the threshold he was about to cross, affording her a level of respect so profound it made her throat ache. Then he turned back. He rose in a single, fluid motion and came to her. He knelt before her, bringing the bowl of warm water and the deerskin pouch of herbs. The air between them had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, solemn gravity. He worked with the same methodical precision as before, but it felt different this time. There was no impersonal detachment. She had invited him in, and he was now a willing participant, not just a dispassionate savior. He cleaned the wound again, his touch as light as he could make it, but the pain was still a blinding, searing force. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, her teeth grinding together, a low moan catching in her throat. She felt a sudden, gentle pressure against her good hand. She opened her eyes. He had stopped working. He was holding his own arm out to her, his left wrist turned upwards, the skin taut over the bone and sinew. He looked directly into her eyes. "Bite," he said, his voice soft, "if it hurts." The offer was so unexpected, so completely alien to anything she had ever known, that for a moment she could only stare. He wasn't offering words of comfort, empty platitudes that the pain would pass. He was offering a piece of himself, a way for her to anchor her pain, to give it a physical outlet, to share its burden in the most direct and primitive way imaginable. A tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a hot path down her temple. It was a tear not of pain, but of a strange, overwhelming gratitude. A small, hysterical laugh, perilously close to a sob, bubbled up inside her. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward. She didn't bite down hard. She just rested her teeth lightly against his skin, a token acceptance of his incredible offer. She could feel the steady, rhythmic pulse of his blood beneath her lips. He did not move, did not flinch, did not pull away. He just held steady, a solid, living anchor in her sea of pain. And in that moment, as she held on, a small, almost imperceptible change happened to his face. The hard, stoic line of his mouth softened at the corners. It was not a smile, not even the beginning of one, but it was a release of tension, a momentary yielding, a fleeting expression of a shared and complex humanity. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He went back to work. He cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied a fresh, thick layer of the dark, fragrant poultice, and bound it with a new, wider strip of clean buckskin. The relief, when he finished, was immense. The throbbing eased, the fire banked, the tightness in her chest loosening its grip. He tied the final knot and sat back on his heels. The task was done. The fire had burned down to a bed of soft, glowing embers, casting a warm, gentle light on their faces. Outside, the world was silent, wrapped in the deep, frozen stillness of the high desert night. The silence in the cave was no longer cold or strained. It was full. It was a comfortable, breathing thing, filled with the weight of what had just passed between them, pain, vulnerability, and a strange, tender intimacy. Eliza looked at Tazi, her hair falling in a damp tangle around her face, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion but clear with a new understanding. He looked back at her, his dark eyes holding hers in the soft, red glow of the embers. The boundary was gone. The wall had come down. There was nothing left to say. No more words were needed. The silence of the cave had become a fragile shelter, a space where the world's violence was held at bay by a small fire and the unspoken truce between two strangers. Eliza's fever had broken in the early hours of the morning, leaving her weak and drenched in sweat, but clear-headed for the first time in what felt like days. The pain in her shoulder was a clean, healing ache now, a dull reminder rather than a raging threat. For a time, there was a quiet rhythm to their existence. He would hunt or gather wood, she would tend the fire and rest, her waterlogged sketchbook laid open on a warm, flat rock, its pages stiff and buckled but its charcoal lines miraculously intact. The change came subtly. Taji returned from a patrol of the canyon rim not with game, but with a new stillness, a heightened state of alert that was different from his usual quiet watchfulness. He said nothing, but Eliza saw it in the way he scanned the mouth of the cave, in the way he tested the tension on his bowstring, in the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The peace was over. Later, when he motioned for her to follow him, she obeyed without question. He led her to the edge of the wash, now mostly dried to a cracked, muddy plain. The air was bitingly cold, still and heavy under a sky the color of lead. He pointed to the ground. There, pressed deep into the semi-frozen mud, was a set of tracks. They were huge, the individual pads and claw marks perfectly preserved. Each print was as large as her outstretched hand. They were fresh, and there were many of them, overlapping, coming down from the higher ridges into the relative shelter of the canyon floor. Eliza stared, her blood running cold. She was a city dweller, an artist who painted docile landscapes, but even she understood the primal message left in the mud. Hunger, desperation. This was the sign of a pack, driven down from the snow-covered high country by starvation, moving into territory they would normally shun. Taji's eyes were not on the tracks. They were scanning the rocks above, reading the unseen currents of the air, listening to a silence that was suddenly full of menace. He placed a hand on the rock face, as if feeling for a vibration in the stone itself. They returned to the cave without a word. The lesson of the wilderness was simple when a greater predator arrives. The lesser creatures go silent and still. He began to work, his movements economical and precise. He took a wide, flat piece of pine bark he had been saving and wedged it upright between two stones near the entrance, creating a small, crude shield. He laid out 4 arrows, their obsidian tips gleaming in the firelight. He handed Eliza a long, thick branch of pitch pine, its end resinous and heavy. He didn't have to explain. She understood. It was her weapon. As dusk began to bleed into the gray afternoon, the first sound came. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a howl, a long, mournful, and chillingly beautiful note that rose from somewhere deep in the canyon. The sound struck the opposite wall and shattered, echoing back and forth, multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a sound that bypassed the ear and resonated deep in the bones, a timeless declaration of hunger and dominion. Another voice joined the first, then another, a chorus of wild, aching loneliness that was the most terrifying sound Eliza had ever heard. Her hand tightened on the pine branch. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Fear was a physical thing, a cold liquid pouring into her stomach. She looked at Tazi. He was a statue carved from the deepening shadows, his bow held loosely in his hand, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the fire's ring of light. He seemed to be listening, not with fear, but with a kind of grim recognition, as if to an old and expected enemy. He glanced at her, his eyes catching the firelight. He nodded towards the flames, then towards the branch in her hand. The message was clear. She thrust the end of the pine branch into the heart of the fire. The resin caught immediately, erupting into a bright, sputtering torch that hissed and popped, casting a wild, dancing light around the cave. The heat on her face was a comfort. The fire was a shield. She was learning the first lesson of the besieged fire pushes back the darkness, and the fear that comes with it. They waited. The howling stopped, replaced by a silence that was even more terrifying. A silence full of padding feet and low, hungry breaths. The attack came without warning. There was no rush, no charge, just a sudden materialization from the gloom. One moment there was nothing. The next a wolf stood at the edge of the firelight. It was a huge, gaunt creature, all bone and sinew and matted gray fur, its ribs stark beneath its hide. Its lips were peeled back from long, yellow teeth, and a low, rumbling growl vibrated in its chest. Its eyes, 2 points of intelligent, malevolent green, were fixed on Eliza. Before the creature could spring, something blurred past her. The sound was a sharp thwack. Tazi's first arrow took the wolf in the throat. It gave a choked, gargling cry and collapsed, its legs scrabbling for a moment in the sand before it went still. But it was only the first. A second gray shape launched itself from the darkness, a blur of speed and fury. It didn't aim for either of them, but for the space between. It slammed into the makeshift pine bark shield, the wood cracking under the impact. The wolf was thrown back, snarling, confused by the unexpected obstacle. That was the signal for the rest of the pack. They flowed out of the darkness, not a frantic mob, but a coordinated, intelligent force. 3 more of them, their forms spectral and menacing as they circled just beyond the reach of the firelight. The Fire Taji's voice was a low, sharp command. Eliza didn't think. She reacted. One of the circling wolves made a feint, darting in close. She swung the heavy, burning torch in a wide, desperate arc. The wolf was fast, leaping back, but not fast enough. The flames licked across its flank. The animal shrieked, a high, pained yelp, and scrambled away. The acrid smell of burning hair filled the air, a sickening, sharp stench. The wolf stopped, turning to snarl, but it kept its distance, its eyes glowing in the darkness, now holding a new respect for the dancing, biting light. The other wolves saw, and they too hesitated, their circling becoming wider, more cautious. It had worked. A wild, fierce surge of triumph shot through Eliza. She was not helpless. She was not prey. She could fight back. She took a step forward, swinging the torch again to drive them further back. It was a mistake. Her aggression had created an opening. As she focused on the wolves in front of her, a 5th one, lower and darker than the others, had slunk around the side, using the deepest shadows of the cave wall as cover. She sensed the movement a fraction of a second too late. She turned, bringing the torch around, but the wolf was already airborne. It wasn't a killing leap. It was a slash, a quick, crippling strike. Its claws, hard as steel hooks, raked across her. She tried to twist away, but there was no time. The claws tore through the fabric of her dress and across her bandaged left shoulder. The pain was blinding, a clean, white-hot agony that ripped through the healing flesh. Her leg buckled. She cried out, stumbling to one knee. The torch hit the ground, its flame nearly extinguished in the sand. But some deep, stubborn instinct refused to let it go out. Even as she fell, her grip on the branch remained locked, and she managed to keep the burning end up, away from the damp ground. It sputtered, dimmed, but did not die. The wolf that had struck her landed, spun, and prepared to leap again, this time for her throat. It never got the chance. Taji moved between them, a silent, lethal shadow. He had no time to knock another arrow. He dropped his bow, and in the same fluid motion, a knife appeared in his hand. It wasn't steel. It was made of bone, its surface polished smooth, its edge wicked and sharp. He didn't shout, didn't make a sound. He met the wolf's charge with a low, brutal efficiency. There was a blur of movement, a single, choked snarl from the animal, and then it was over. The wolf collapsed in a heap, a dark stain spreading on the sand beneath it. Taji stood over it for a single heartbeat, his chest rising and falling, the bone knife dripping in his hand. He looked at the remaining 3 wolves. They had stopped their circling. They looked from their 2 dead companions to the silent, deadly man, and then to the woman who was pushing herself back up, the flame of her torch now burning bright and defiant again. The odds had changed. The fight had gone out of them. This was no longer a battle against helpless prey. One of them turned, melting back into the darkness. The other 2 followed a second later, and then they were gone. The night was silent again, except for the pop and hiss of the fire, the distant sigh of the wind, and the harsh, ragged sound of 2 people breathing in the smoke-filled air. Eliza stood shaking, the adrenaline draining away, leaving in its place a profound weakness and the searing, throbbing reality of her shoulder. Taji turned to her, his face a mask of stone in the firelight, but his eyes were dark with a concern that was now unmistakable. He looked at the fresh blood soaking through her bandage, then at her face, pale and strained. He took the torch from her unresisting hand and wedged it into a crack in the cave wall, where it continued to burn, a steady beacon against the night. Then, he gently took her arm and led her back to the fire. He motioned for her to sit and began preparing to tend to her wound once more. He warmed the water, laid out a clean strip of buckskin. As he reached for her shoulder, the old, stubborn pride flared up in her, a last flickering ember of defiance. "I can do it," she said, her voice unsteady. She tried to take the cloth from him. He didn't let go. His fingers remained firm on the cloth, his gaze holding hers. He didn't argue or command. He just waited, his expression calm, his eyes asking a silent question. "Do you trust me?" The moment stretched, a quiet battle of wills. She looked at his steady hand, at the blood on the bone knife he had tucked back into his belt, at the bodies of the wolves lying still in the darkness. She thought of the searing pain and of the memory of his wrist against her teeth. Her shoulders slumped. She let go of the cloth, surrendering. Slowly, she turned, presenting her injured shoulder to him, an act of complete and total trust. He worked in silence, his touch now infinitely gentle as he cleaned the fresh gashes. The cuts were not deep, but they were vicious, laid open over the still healing wound beneath. The pain was intense, but she bore it without a sound, her eyes fixed on the fire, her jaw tight. He applied a new poultice and bound the shoulder tightly, his work deft and sure. When he was finished, they sat in silence for a long time, the warmth of the fire pushing back the chill of the night and the deeper chill of the violence they had just survived. They had stood together, fought together. They had been tested, not as individuals, but as a unit, and they had survived. Taji finally broke the silence, his voice low, little more than a murmur. "Were you afraid?" Eliza considered the question. She thought of the glowing green eyes, the glint of teeth, the paralyzing terror of the first howl. "Yes," she answered, her voice soft but clear. She turned to look at him, at his strong, quiet profile lit by the flames. "But less than when I was alone. The aftermath of the battle was a brutal, pragmatic affair. In the cold light of the new day, the bodies of the two wolves lay stiff in the sand, a stark testament to the night's violence. Eliza expected to feel revulsion, but the sharp, gnawing hunger in her belly had supplanted all other emotions. Survival had a way of stripping away the softer sentiments of her former life. Under Tazi's silent instruction, she learned. She held the legs while he skinned the animals with his bone knife, the movements of his hands so efficient and practiced it was like watching a master craftsman at his work. Nothing was wasted. The thick winter pelts were scraped and set aside. The meat was cut into long, thin strips, and even some of the bones were kept. A grim, smoky fire was built, and soon the strips of meat were hanging from a green branch, slowly curing in the fragrant smoke. The cave, which had been a sanctuary, then a fortress, now became a home. With the immediate threats of starvation and predators dealt with, a new and unfamiliar rhythm began to establish itself between them. The days grew brighter. The relentless wind died down, and the sun, when it cleared the canyon rim, carried a surprising warmth. It was a false spring, a brief, benevolent pause in winter's siege, and they used every moment of it. While the meat dried and the wolf pelts were stretched on a makeshift frame, Eliza turned to her own salvaged treasure. She carefully separated the stiff, warped pages of her sketchbook, laying them open on a large, flat rock that soaked up the afternoon sun. The watercolor sketches were mostly lost, transformed into vague, muddy bleeds of color, but the charcoal drawings, the strong black lines that formed the bones of her work, had held, faded and blurred. But there, she spent hours by the rock, a sense of quiet purpose settling over her as she tended to these ghosts of her past, her fingers tracing the faint outlines of a world that now seemed a lifetime away. Taji, in turn, began to teach her. His lessons were never spoken. He would simply begin a task and expect her to watch, to learn through observation. He showed her how to braid thin, incredibly strong cordage from the sinew of the wolf. He would hand her a length, then demonstrate a complex, looping knot, a snare for catching rabbits or birds. He would make the motions slowly, once, then hand it to her. Her first attempts were a clumsy tangle of knots, her artist's fingers unused to such practical, life-or-death geometry. She would grow frustrated, her cheeks flushing with shame at her own incompetence. Tazi would never show impatience. He would simply take the cord, undo her mistakes with a few deft flicks of his wrist, and repeat the slow, deliberate motions again and again, until, Finally, her fingers learned the pattern, and she produced a perfect sliding loop. He acknowledged her success with a single, brief nod, a gesture of approval that felt more rewarding than any prize she had ever won at an Eastern art exhibition. As she worked, a strange thing began to happen. To ease the frustration of her clumsy fingers, she started to hum. She didn't even realize she was doing it at first. It was a quiet, half-forgotten tune, a melody from her childhood in the cold, snowy hills of Vermont, a lullaby her mother used to sing while mending clothes by the fire. The simple, sad little song filled the quiet air of the cave, a sound of impossible softness in that harsh, stone world. The first time it happened, Taji stopped his work. He didn't look at her, but his hands went still, his head cocked as if listening to a strange new bird call. He listened for a full minute, his profile unmoving against the light from the cave mouth. Then, just as quietly, he resumed his work, the moment of shared stillness passing without comment. But after that, he seemed to listen for it. As Eliza grew more comfortable, the humming sometimes gave way to quiet, half-whispered lyrics about snow falling on pine trees and a warm hearth waiting at home. He never spoke of it, but she felt him listening. He was learning the rhythms of her world, just as she was learning the rhythms of his. He was learning to hear the song beneath her silence. One afternoon, with a piece of charcoal salvaged from the fire, she began to draw again. She drew the twisted shape of a juniper tree, the sharp, geometric patterns of the canyon wall, the way the light fell across the rocks at dawn. The land was her subject, vast and impersonal, but her compositions felt empty. They lacked a heart, a focal point. She looked up and saw Taji standing at the mouth of the cave, looking out over the canyon. He was watching the sky, his body relaxed but alert, his silhouette a dark, powerful shape against the bright afternoon light. He was as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the sky. He was its heart, the urge to capture him, to record the quiet strength in his posture, the sharp line of his jaw. The way his hair was held back by the simple leather band was overwhelming. She began to sketch, her charcoal flying across the rough paper. She drew the outline of his shoulders, the shape of his head. He must have sensed her intense focus, because he turned his head slightly. His eyes met hers. He looked from her face to the sketchbook in her lap, and his expression became guarded, closed off. Eliza's hand froze. She remembered the stories, the beliefs. She had put him at ease, and now she had broken that trust with her own selfish need to create. "I won't draw your face," she said quickly, her voice soft. "I promise." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching. He seemed to be weighing her sincerity. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It binds the soul," he said, his voice quiet, offering not a rebuke, but an explanation. He was trusting her with a piece of his truth. He turned back to look out over the canyon, giving her his trust and his back. Eliza's heart ached with a strange mixture of gratitude and creative fervor. She kept her promise. She did not draw his face. Instead, she drew his form from behind, a strong, solitary figure standing at the edge of the light. She drew the powerful lines of his back, the way his shoulders seemed to echo the slope of the mountains in the distance. In her drawing, he was not just a man looking at a landscape. He was the living spine of the land itself, the point from which all the other lines of rock and shadow drew their strength. He became the story of the place. The nights were the quietest time. The fire burned low, the world outside was a deep, frozen black, and the walls of the cave seemed to draw in, creating a small, warm pocket of existence. It was in one of these deep silences that he finally spoke of his past. He had been staring into the embers, his face grim, lost in a memory she could not see. "There was a camp," he said, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear it, "down by the river. Many families." He paused, his fingers tracing a pattern in the sand. The grass was green there. He fell silent for so long she thought he was finished. But then he spoke again, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Soldiers came. In the morning. Blue coats. He stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. He didn't need to say what had happened. The story was written in the history of this whole territory, a story of fire and blood and loss. Camp raided, people scattered, families broken. Eliza's heart constricted. The easy, empty platitudes of her world rose to her lips. "I'm so sorry." But she swallowed them. She knew, with a certainty that came from the very marrow of her bones, that such words would be a profound insult. They were meaningless here. They could not bring back the dead or mend a broken world. They were the words of a stranger, an outsider who could never comprehend the depth of his loss. Instead, she said nothing. She simply reached for a piece of dry pine from the woodpile and gently placed it on the glowing embers. The wood caught, and a fresh, bright flame leaped up, pushing back the shadows, warming the space between them. It was a simple, practical gesture. It said, "I am here with you in the dark. I will help you tend the fire." He glanced at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of acknowledgement, a silent understanding that was deeper than any apology. A few nights later, they saw it. They were sitting in comfortable silence when Tazi suddenly stiffened. He looked up, past the mouth of the cave, towards the sky. Eliza followed his gaze. The night was crystal clear, the stars like chips of ice scattered on black velvet, and rising into that perfect sky, from somewhere far down the canyon, was a thin, perfectly straight column of smoke. It rose without a waver, a pale gray line drawn against the darkness, in the still, frozen air. Smoke that rose so straight and true could only mean one thing: a campfire, a big one, well tended. They both watched it for a long, silent minute. It was the first sign of any other human life since the storm. It should have been a comfort, a promise of rescue, but it felt like a threat, a violation of their small, fragile world. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The same thought was in both their minds. The long peace was over. The outside world had found them. The next morning, Tazi was gone before she woke. He returned an hour later, his movements as silent as ever, but his face was grim. He carried nothing in his hands. He simply stood before her and pointed with his chin towards the entrance of the cave. She followed him out into the sharp, cold air. He led her to a place where a stand of thin pines marked the edge of the forest. He pointed to the ground. The tracks were unmistakable, not the big, round prints of a wolf or the delicate cloven tracks of a deer. These were horseshoe prints, at least 3 different horses. And they were shod with iron, a clear sign of riders from the towns and settlements below. A lone trapper or prospector might have one horse, often unshod. This was a group. And beside the hoof prints, Tazi pointed to another set of marks in the dirt, the thin, parallel lines of a wheeled cart or a buckboard. The tracks were fresh, the edges still sharp and clear. They had not been made by chance. They were following the line of the canyon, moving with purpose. A cold dread, entirely different from the fear of wolves or storms, began to seep into Eliza's bones. This was a human threat, which was infinitely more complex and dangerous. She looked down at herself, at her dress, now a ragged, filthy wreck, stained with mud and blood and smoke. She looked at her hands, calloused and scratched. She was no longer the lady artist from the East. She was a survivor, a wild thing. And then, the memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. The world she had left behind, the world of sheriffs and newspapers and concerned citizens, the world of wagon trains and settlements. That world would not have simply forgotten her. A missing woman from the East was news. She was a story. And stories like hers, out here, often came with a price attached, a reward, posted in every town and saloon from Flagstaff to Prescott. For any news of the lost painter, Eliza called her. She looked from the tracks in the ground to the distant mountains. She was no longer just lost. She was valuable. And in this land, anything of value was hunted. The faint column of smoke they had seen in the night was no longer a mystery. It was a promise. They were coming. The man who arrived from the world below did not emerge from the landscape. He intruded upon it. He came on a tall bay horse, its coat dark with sweat, its breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds in the cold air. The jingle of his harness and the creak of his leather saddle were loud, alien sounds in the profound quiet of the canyon. He was a man made of noise and hurry. He reined his horse in at a respectful distance from the cave, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He was a white man, dressed not in buckskin but in durable, trail-worn canvas trousers and a thick wool coat that had seen better days. A wide-brimmed hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a face that was weathered but not unkind at first glance. He was smiling, a broad, easy smile that seemed to offer friendship. "Afternoon," he called out, his voice affable. "Name's Marlowe Pike. My horse has thrown a shoe and I saw your smoke. Wondered if I might trouble you to warm myself by your fire for a spell before I make my way down to Copper Vale." Taji had appeared at the mouth of the cave as silently as a shadow. He held his bow, not aimed, but ready. He said nothing, his face a mask of stone. Eliza, drawn by the strange voice, came to stand behind him. Her instinct, born of a lifetime of civilized interaction, was one of welcome. A traveler was in need. But looking past the man's smile, she felt a prickle of unease. The horse didn't look lame, it looked exhausted, pushed hard, and the man's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, did not match his smile. They were busy. "You're welcome to the fire, Mr. Pike," Eliza said, her voice sounding strange and formal to her own ears. She stepped forward, out from behind the shelter of Tazi's presence. Marlowe Pike's smile widened as his gaze fell on her. If he was surprised to see a white woman in such a place, he hid it well. "Well, now, it's a pleasure, ma'am, a real pleasure." He dismounted with a weary groan, tying his horse to a nearby juniper. As he walked towards them, his eyes were in constant motion, and Eliza realized with a chill that he wasn't just looking, he was taking inventory. His gaze flickered over the hanging strips of smoked wolf meat, calculating the quantity of their provisions. It rested for a moment on the two thick wolf pelts, not as blankets, but as evidence of a successful and dangerous hunt. It swept over Tazi's bow, the quiver of arrows, and the long, old rifle that now rested against the cave wall, assessing their defenses. And then his eyes came back to her. He looked at her ragged dress, her scratched hands, her face smudged with soot. He was not seeing a woman in distress. He was seeing an object, a prize, something out of place and therefore valuable. He was appraising her. He settled himself by the fire with a grateful sigh, holding his hands out to the warmth. He kept up a steady stream of chatter, talking about the boomtown of Copper Vale, the price of silver, the new sheriff. It was the language of a world she had almost forgotten, a world of commerce and contracts and laws made by men. "It's a godsend, finding you folks," he said, rubbing his hands together. "This whole territory's been buzzing for weeks, ever since that notice went up." Eliza, who had been listening with a kind of detached curiosity, felt a sudden, cold stillness spread through her chest. "Notice?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Oh, yes, ma'am," Pike said, his blue eyes locking onto hers. He was still smiling, a big one, posted by the territorial marshal himself, about a missing lady, an artist, they say, from back east. Last seen with a wagon train that got itself lost in the first winter storm. There's a handsome reward offered for any news of her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eliza could feel the blood draining from her face. She was no longer a survivor. She was a commodity, a stack of gold coins waiting to be claimed. She was the news. She felt, rather than saw, Tazi move beside her. He didn't make a sound, but the quality of the air changed. She glanced at him. His body had not tensed, but a profound and dangerous stillness had settled over him. His hand was resting lightly, almost casually, on the stock of the old rifle that leaned against the rock. "Your horse is rested," Taji said. His voice was flat, low, and carried an unmistakable weight. "The sun is low. You should go." It was not a suggestion. Marlowe Pike's smile finally faltered. He looked from Tazi's hand on the rifle to the impassive, dark eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than false geniality showed on his face. It was a quick, hard assessment. He was measuring a new kind of value, now the cost of a fight. Eliza felt a surge of panic. This was not how things were done. There were rules of hospitality, of civility. "Taji," she whispered, her voice sharp with alarm. "He's only a traveler." "He is not a traveler," Taji said. His voice a low murmur meant only for her, his eyes never leaving Pike. "He is a hunter." The raw, brutal truth of the statement silenced her. She saw it then. The easy smile was a lure. The story of the lame horse was a lie. This was not a chance encounter. He had been searching. The smoke from their fire had been a beacon, drawing not a rescuer, but a claimant. This was the clash. The first true collision between the world she had come from and the world she now inhabited. Her world offered a hand to a stranger. His world saw the teeth hidden behind the stranger's smile. To her, courtesy was a virtue. To him, it was a fatal vulnerability. Marlowe Pike pushed himself to his feet, a slow, deliberate movement. He brushed the sand from his trousers, his smile returning. But it was a different smile now. It was thin, tight, and held no warmth at all. "You're right, friend," he said to Tazi, his tone laced with a new, mocking edge. "The light is failing. Best be on my way." He walked back to his horse, untying the reins with unhurried movements. He swung himself up into the saddle and looked down at them. A man from a higher place, both literally and figuratively. He looked past Tazi, his eyes settling on Eliza one last time. "You should know." "Ma'am," he said, his voice conversational, but carrying the chill of the coming night. "The law down in the flatlands is a particular thing. It's not the same as the law of the mountains." He tipped his hat, a gesture of mock politeness, and then he turned his horse and rode away. The sound of its hooves on the rock a fading, rhythmic threat. They watched him go until he was a small speck disappearing into the deep blue shadows that were swallowing the canyon. A profound silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The friendly, life-giving flames now seemed small and inadequate, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. "He will bring others," Eliza stated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Tazi did not answer. He was already moving, his earlier stillness replaced by a focused, urgent energy. He began to gather their things, the wolf pelts, the smoked meat, his small pouch of herbs. His message was clear. Their home was no longer safe. They had to leave. That night, they made a cold camp miles up the canyon, in a narrow cleft of rock with no fire to betray their position. Sleep was impossible. Eliza huddled in the wolf pelt, the cold from the rock seeping into her bones, but it was the memory of Marlowe Pike's appraising eyes that chilled her more than the freezing air. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, Tazi, who had been keeping watch, touched her shoulder. He pointed. Far below, down in the direction of their old cave, a tiny spark of light appeared, then another and another. A campfire. No, several. Then Pike, or one of his companions, did something else. They must have thrown a bundle of wet leaves or green wood onto their fire. A thick plume of smoke billowed up, momentarily illuminated from below by the flames. It was a dark, greasy smudge against the starry sky. Even in the darkness, it was a clear and unmistakable signal, a marker for others, perhaps further down the canyon, to show them the location. Here, the prize is here. Taji stood motionless, a silhouette against the faint starlight, watching the distant fires. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his entire being, feeling the subtle shifts in the wind, the vibrations in the ancient stone. Eliza looked at the small fire they had left behind in their cave, which would now be nothing but cold ash. And she looked at the new, hostile fires of the hunters below. A storm was coming, not of wind and water, but of men and greed. And the quiet, watchful man standing beside her was the only thing between her and the storm. He stood so still, the world seemed to hold its breath around him, waiting for his next move. There was no dawn, only a slow, grudging dilution of the blackness. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down, making every breath a conscious effort. They had moved twice in the night, Tazi guiding them higher into the labyrinth of rock, always seeking higher ground. Sleep had been a series of brief, shivering lapses into a state of anxious exhaustion. The sound reached them first, not the sharp crack of a rifle, but a low, wet, rhythmic sucking. It was the sound of shod horses struggling through half-frozen mud. Taji, who had been as motionless as the granite shelf he was perched on, came to his feet in a single, silent motion. He put a hand on Eliza's arm, a firm pressure that was both a warning and a command. She followed his gaze. Far below, at the edge of the sparse pine forest that fringed the canyon, a group of riders emerged from the morning mist. They were dark, lumbering shapes, their progress clumsy and loud. 5 of them, no, a 6th, leading a pack mule. They moved in a ragged line, following the tracks that Tazi and Eliza had left, tracks that were now a clear, damning trail in the thawing mud. Marlowe Pike was not among them, but his presence was a palpable thing, a shadow directing this slow, inevitable hunt. There was no time for discussion, no need for a plan to be spoken aloud. Taji's face was grim, his eyes narrowed to slits as he calculated the angles of their approach. The time they had left. He knew this terrain, every game trail, every hidden ledge. But he also knew that 5 armed men on horseback could cover ground with a speed he and Eliza, on foot, could not hope to match on the open flats. Their only chance was the rock, to become a part of the mountain, to use its treacherous nature as both a shield and a weapon. He grabbed the rifle and the small pack of provisions, and with a sharp, downward flick of his head, he gave the order, "Move!" He didn't take the obvious path upwards. Instead, he led her along a narrow, almost invisible ledge that seemed to lead to a sheer rock face. It was a path that defied logic, a trail meant for mountain goats, not men. But just as it seemed to end, he slipped behind a huge, weathered curtain of rock. Eliza followed, her heart pounding, and found herself on another trail, hidden from below, a secret artery running through the heart of the stone. They moved fast, a desperate, lung-searing scramble. Eliza's city-soft muscles screamed in protest, but the sounds of the men below, their muffled shouts and the occasional curse carrying up on the still air, were a more potent fuel than any reserve of strength she might have had. They were being herded, driven higher, and she knew with a sickening certainty that the hunters were enjoying the chase. Their path was blocked by a stream, swollen with melting ice from the higher peaks. It wasn't wide, but it was fast and violent, a churning soup of brown water and jagged plates of ice that ground against each other with a harsh, scraping sound. There was no bridge, only a treacherous series of slick, moss-covered boulders. Tazi went first, leaping from one stone to the next with a fluid, practiced grace. He reached the other side and turned, holding out a hand to her. Eliza took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on his hand, a solid, steady point in a world of chaotic motion. She made the first leap, her worn boots slipping on the slick surface, but she found her balance. The second leap was longer. She pushed off hard, her eyes on the next rock. Her foot landed, but the rock was not stable. It was coated in a thin, treacherous layer of black ice. Her boot skidded sideways. With a cry of alarm, she pinwheeled her arms, her balance gone. She was going into the water. But this time, it was her hand that shot out, her reflexes honed by weeks of survival. This time, it was his hand she caught, her fingers closing around his wrist with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The jolt nearly pulled him in with her, but he dug his heels in, his body a rigid anchor. He pulled, and she scrambled onto the rock beside him. Safe. And then, in a moment of cruel irony, the very rock that had saved him betrayed him. As he shifted his weight to pull her further onto the bank, his other foot slipped, plunging into the narrow gap between 2 large boulders. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pure pain, and his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He was wedged, trapped. For a single, terrifying second, they were frozen. The hunters' voices were closer now, They couldn't stay here. Eliza's mind, which a month ago would have dissolved into panic, was now shockingly clear. She saw the problem, and she looked for the solution. The branch, she yelled over the roar of the water, pointing to a thick, dead log wedged against the bank a few feet away. Taji's face was pale, his jaw tight with pain, but he understood. While he braced himself, Eliza scrambled over the rocks, her movements now sure and desperate. She put her shoulder to the end of the heavy, waterlogged branch, pushing with all her might. It shifted. She pushed again, her muscles straining, and managed to lever it into the water. She guided the heavy end towards him. "Use it as a brace," she shouted. He grabbed the branch, using it to shift his weight, to take the pressure off his trapped leg. The veins in his neck stood out as he pulled. There was a sickening, grinding sound of bone and rock, and then he was free. He collapsed onto the bank beside her, his face beaded with sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had saved her from falling. She had saved him from being trapped. The debt was paid, the roles reversed in the space of a single, frantic minute. There was no time for relief. A flat, angry crack echoed through the canyon, and a lead hornet whined past her ear, striking a shower of stone splinters from the rock face just above her head. They were being shot at. The time for stealth was over. Now, it was a race. Taji was on his feet, ignoring the pain, pulling her along. His run was no longer the silent, effortless glide of a predator. There was a limp, a barely perceptible hesitation in his stride, but he did not slow down. They scrambled upwards, using the boulders and twisted junipers as cover. Another shot, this one closer, thudding into the soft bark of a tree beside them. They were exposed, a clear line of sight for the men below. Then Taji pointed. Ahead of them was a dark, vertical fissure in the rock face, a narrow slot canyon no wider than a man's shoulders. A sky window, a stone throat leading to the other side of the ridge. It was their only chance. They plunged into the narrow passage. The air grew cold and still, the sounds of the pursuit suddenly muffled. It was a tight squeeze, the rough rocks scraping at their clothes and skin. At the narrowest point, the fabric of Eliza's dress, already torn and weakened, caught on a sharp spur of rock. She pulled, and it ripped with a loud, tearing sound, a long gash from her hip to her knee. She didn't care. She was through. They emerged onto a high, wind-swept ridge, the world falling away on either side. They had a lead, but Taji was faltering. He leaned heavily against the rock wall, his head bowed, his breathing harsh. Eliza looked at his leg. The buckskin was torn at the knee, and there was a long, bloody gash underneath. But it was his side that drew her horrified gaze. His old wound, the one he had gotten in the rockfall of the flood, had reopened, perhaps in the creek or in the scramble up the rocks. A dark, damning stain was spreading across the buckskin of his shirt, a slow, steady seep of crimson. The weakness she saw in him was not just from the pain in his leg. He was losing blood. He was weakening with every step. He pushed himself off the wall, ready to run again, but his movement was unsteady. They wouldn't make it. Not like this. They would be run down within the hour. In that moment, something inside Eliza shifted. The last vestiges of the frightened, dependent woman who had been dragged from the floodwaters were burned away, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a partner, and her partner was hurt. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. She looked around, her eyes scanning the terrain with a new, tactical awareness. Not far away, a cluster of massive, house-sized boulders had created a small, sheltered hollow, a natural fortress, hidden from the trail below. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm, imbued with an authority that surprised them both. "We stop here." He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain and exhaustion, and shook his head. "They will find us." "They will find us if we keep moving," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "You're hurt, Taji. You can't go on like this." She put a hand on his arm, and her touch was not one of a supplicant, but of a comrade. She looked directly into his eyes, and the old words came to her lips. but their meaning was transformed, forged into something new by the fire of the chase. "Please," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. "Help me to help you." His eyes, which had seen so much, now held a profound bewilderment. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. He, the rescuer, the protector, the silent, unshakable pillar of strength, was being told to stand down, to accept aid from the very person he had saved. The world had been turned upside down. He opened his mouth to protest, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and he swayed, his hand going to the rock wall to steady himself. He looked at the blood on his shirt, then back at her determined face. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a weary, reluctant acceptance. He let her lead him into the sheltered hollow between the boulders. It was a good place, protected from the wind, with a clear view of the back trail. As she eased him down to sit with his back against the rock, he looked at her, his expression a mixture of pain, confusion, and a dawning, grudging respect. A faint, ironic ghost of a smile touched his lips. He whispered the words, a faint echo of his own confusion from a lifetime ago in the cave. "Wait, what are you doing?" Eliza's heart ached with the weight and the beauty of the moment. The roles were now completely and irrevocably reversed. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, full of a warmth that had nothing to do with a fire. "Knocking first," she said softly. She reached out and, with her knuckles, she gently tapped the rough surface of the boulder beside his head. Once, twice, the same quiet, respectful ritual he had shown her. She was acknowledging the boundary, and she was showing him that she understood. Then, she got to work. She took the water skin and a strip of clean cloth from their pack. Her hands, she noted with a distant sense of pride, were perfectly steady. She gently pushed aside the torn buckskin of his shirt. The gash was long and deep, bleeding sluggishly. With a focused, gentle competence that mirrored his own actions from days before, she began to clean the wound, her touch sure and her purpose clear. He was hers to protect now. Trust had changed hands. Tazi's strength, though formidable, was finite. The wound in his side, coupled with the wrenching of his leg, was taking its toll. Each step was a visible effort, his movements losing their fluid grace. They could not outrun the hunters, but they could outthink them. It was Tazi who found the place, guided by an instinct for sanctuary that ran deeper than memory. It was an old mission, a forgotten relic of a different faith, slowly surrendering to the elements. The adobe walls, thick as a man's arm is long, were cracked and crumbling, but they were solid. A heavy, weathered wooden door hung crookedly on one remaining hinge, and the bell tower was a hollow mouth, its bell long since silenced by rust and time. It was a place of ghosts, but it was a fortress. They barricaded themselves inside. The main room was a cavern of cool, dusty shadows, the air thick with the scent of dry earth and decay. A single beam of muted sunlight lanced down from a hole in the roof, illuminating a swirling universe of dust motes. There were narrow, high windows, more like slits for arrows than panes for light, offering perfect firing positions while making them difficult targets. Taji sank to the floor, his back against the cool adobe, his face pale and slick with sweat. Eliza immediately went to work, her hands now steady and practiced. She examined his wounds, her touch gentle but firm. While the gash on his leg was clean, the wound in his side had begun to bleed again with their frantic journey. She applied a fresh poultice from their dwindling supply and bound it tightly. Her brow furrowed in concentration. The student had become the healer. They did not have to wait long. The sound of approaching horses carried clearly in the still mountain air. The riders circled the mission once, their voices sharp and wary. Before dismounting, footsteps crunched outside. Then, a voice, dripping with false bonhomie, cut through the heavy door. It was Marlowe Pike. "Well now, this is a cozy little spot you found," he called out. "But the game's over. Send out the lady, and we'll let the Apache go. No need for anyone else to get hurt." Eliza looked at Taji. His hand rested on the stock of his rifle, but his eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He was gathering what remained of his strength. The decision, she realized, was hers. The men outside wanted her. She was the prize. She could walk out, and perhaps, just perhaps, Pike would keep his word. It would be the sensible thing to do, the civilized solution. She thought of the cold calculation in Pike's eyes. She thought of Tazi's hand pulling her from the flood, of his wrist offered in her moment of agony, of his body shielding hers from the wolves. She thought of his silent teachings, his quiet companionship, the shared warmth of their small fire against the vast, indifferent cold. He had not treated her as a prize. He had treated her as a partner. She rose and walked to the door. She didn't open it. She stood beside it, in the deepest shadows of the room, and pitched her voice to carry through the thick wood. "I choose where I stand. Mr. Pike," she called out, her voice clear and steady, without a trace of the fear that was a cold knot in her stomach. "And I am standing here." A moment of surprised silence from outside. Then Pike's laugh, a harsh, ugly sound. "Playing house with the native, or you don't be a fool, girl. That reward is big enough as it is. But a story about a brave rescue from a savage kidnapper, that's a story that pays a bonus." The lie was so bald, so venomous, it stole her breath. He wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was a crafter of narratives, a man who would twist their story of survival into a sordid, profitable fiction. He would make Tazi the villain to inflate his own reward. The sheer, cynical cruelty of it ignited a cold, hard anger in her. "He is not a kidnapper," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "He saved my life." "That's not how the story will be told." Pike's voice came back, smug and certain. "Now, I'll ask you one last time." He was answered not by words, but by Tazi. Eliza hadn't even seen him move. He had dragged himself across the floor to a small leather pouch in their pack, with slow, deliberate movements. He was taking pinches of the black powder used for the rifle and carefully pouring it into a small, dry gourd he had hollowed out. He unraveled a length of sinew, attaching it to a flint shard at one end and wedging the other into the gourd. He had created a crude but effective trip mine. He gestured to a smaller, secondary door on the side of the mission, its wood rotten and splintered. He pointed to the floor just inside it, then handed the line to Eliza, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He didn't need to speak the plan. "Draw them to that door. When I give the signal, pull." The main door groaned as a heavy shoulder slammed against it from outside. The wood was thick, but it wouldn't hold forever. "Break it down." Pike's voice was sharp with impatience. Eliza took a deep breath. She moved to one of the narrow window slits, Tazi's rifle in her hands. It was heavy, unfamiliar. She rested the long barrel on the sill, the cool metal a strange comfort. Outside, two of Pike's men were shouldering a heavy log, preparing to use it as a battering ram. Tazi had crawled to the side door, his own bow in hand. He gave her a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. Now. Eliza aimed high, not at the men, but at the adobe wall just above their heads. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. Outside, the men dropped the log with a curse, plaster and dust raining down on them. They scrambled for cover. "She's got a rifle," one of them yelled. "Go around the side door," Pike commanded, his voice tight with fury. It was exactly what Tazi had anticipated. Eliza watched through the slit as two of the men broke from cover and ran towards the side of the mission. They were shadows, moving fast. She saw Tazi tense, his eyes fixed on the rotten wood of the side door. He waited, his timing perfect, until he heard the footsteps right outside. He gave a low, sharp hiss. Eliza pulled the sinew line taut. The explosion was not large, but it was brutally effective. A bright orange flash was followed by a concussive boom and a cloud of thick, acrid black smoke. The rotten door was blown inwards, splintering into 1,000 pieces. Through the smoke, she saw the two men thrown backwards, their bodies limp dolls. They did not get up. A furious, panicked volley of shots erupted from the remaining men. Bullets thudded into the thick adobe walls, sending dust and debris flying. One slammed through the main door, whining through the interior of the church like an angry insect before burying itself in the far wall. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. In the chaos, Eliza moved to another window slit, her heart hammering. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were clear. She was no longer just a painter. She was a combatant. She saw one of the men, Pike's remaining two, peeking out from behind a crumbling wall. She didn't aim to hit him. She aimed to keep his head down. She fired, the shot kicking up dirt a foot from his position. He ducked back, cursing. She was providing cover, creating a space for Tazi to move. But the fight was turning. Through the swirling smoke, a dark object came flying through the shattered side doorway. It landed on the dusty floor with a soft thud and a splash of liquid. A kerosene lantern. Before they could react, another object flew through the air, a lit match. The floor erupted in a whoosh of flame. The fire, fed by the spilled kerosene and the dry, ancient wooden pews, climbed the adobe wall in a hungry, roaring sheet. The heat was instantaneous, a blistering wave that drove them back. Taji reacted without thinking. He grabbed one of the heavy, moth-eaten wool blankets from their pack, the one she had used during her fever. Ignoring the flames, he lunged forward, beating at the fire with the heavy cloth, trying to smother it. He was a whirlwind of motion, a desperate, solitary figure battling the growing inferno. He was succeeding, but at a cost. The edge of the blanket caught fire, and the flames licked up his arm, setting his buckskin sleeve alight. He grunted in pain but did not stop until the last of the kerosene fire was extinguished, leaving a blackened, smoking scar on the floor and wall. He threw the smoldering blanket down and staggered back, clutching his hand, his face a mask of agony. "From outside?" Marlowe Pike laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. "Getting hot in there, give it up, you're finished." It was the voice, that smug, self-assured voice, that finally did it. It was a voice from another lifetime, from a world of gaslights and galleries and polite deception. Eliza stared at the man, a silhouette framed by the smoke in the broken doorway, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The face, weathered by the western sun, was older, harder, but the eyes, pale and calculating, and that voice, she knew that voice. The rifle in her hands felt impossibly heavy. She let it fall to her side. She stepped out from the shadows, her face smudged with soot, her dress in tatters, her eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with the one on the wall. "Marlowe," she said, her voice quiet, but it carried in the sudden lull. It was not a question. Pike flinched, his head snapping towards her, his smile faltering. He did not recognize her name. He recognized the tone of someone who knew him. "I remember you," Eliza continued, taking another step forward into the light. "From Philadelphia, you called yourself an investor, a patron of the arts." Pike's face went blank with shock, the mask of the jovial frontiersman falling away to reveal the cornered rat underneath. "You came to the Pennsylvania Academy." Eliza's voice grew stronger, colder. "You charmed the board of directors. You spoke of funding an exhibition, of bringing new artists to light. My friends, they trusted you. They gave you their savings, everything they had, for a share in your New Art syndicate." She took another step. Taji was staring at her, his pain forgotten, his expression one of utter astonishment. "And then you vanished," she said, her voice ringing with the cold fury of a long-held betrayal. "You and the exhibition fund. You left good people with nothing but empty promises and broken dreams. I saw my friend, a brilliant sculptor, have to sell his tools just to eat." The last of Pike's men, a young, nervous-looking man, was staring at his boss, his rifle held loosely, his face a picture of confusion. This was not the simple bounty hunt he had signed up for. "You're not a lawman, Marlowe," Eliza said, her voice like the crack of a whip. "You're not even a bounty hunter. You're just a common swindler, a cheap, lying thief who has run out of drawing rooms to cheat." The silence that followed was absolute. Pike's face, illuminated by the harsh sunlight from the doorway, was a canvas of pure, murderous rage. The mask was gone. The game was up. The fire on the wall was nothing compared to the one now burning in the open. He raised his pistol, his eyes promising a final, violent end to the story. The click was a small, dry sound, utterly insignificant against the backdrop of the dying fire and the rasp of ragged breathing. But in the sudden, tense silence of the old mission, it was as loud as a thunderclap. Marlowe Pike's pistol was aimed squarely at Eliza's heart, his face a mask of pure, murderous fury, and the hammer had fallen on an empty chamber. He stared at the useless weapon in his hand as if it had personally betrayed him. The bluff was over, the story had ended, and he was not the hero. He was just a man with an empty gun. Behind him, his one remaining man, the young one with the nervous eyes, lowered his own rifle. He looked from Pike's contorted face to Eliza's steady, accusing gaze, and a decision was made. He was a hired gun, not a party to a swindler's personal feud. He began to back away, melting into the shadows. Pike was alone. He looked at Eliza, his mouth twisting into a vicious snarl. He looked at Tazi, who was now leaning against the wall, his bone knife in his hand, his eyes burning with a cold, patient fire despite his injuries. The odds, which had been so overwhelmingly in Pike's favor, had irrevocably shifted. The mountain itself seemed to have passed judgment. Without another word, Marlowe Pike turned and fled. He did not run. He scuttled away like a thing of the dark, leaving the wreckage of his greed behind him. He left the two men who had been blasted by the explosion, broken figures lying in the dirt. He left the story unfinished. He simply vanished back into the flatlands from which he had come. The silence he left behind was profound, a vacuum that slowly filled with the sound of the wind sighing through the broken doorway and the low moans of the two men outside. The rage drained out of Eliza, leaving her weak and trembling. Her first instinct, the deep-seated impulse of the world she had left behind, was for order, for healing. "We have to get a doctor," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She started towards the door, a frantic, useless energy propelling her. Taji's voice, low and laced with pain, stopped her. "There is no doctor here." She turned to him, a protest on her lips, but the look in his eyes silenced her. It was not a look of cruelty, but of profound, weary truth. The trail down was hard and long. The town of Copper Vale was a day's ride for a healthy man on a good horse. For them, on foot, with him injured, it was an impossible distance, and for the men outside, their lives measured now in shallow, rattling breaths. It was an eternity. The mountain had already delivered its verdict. She looked out at the two men. One was already still, his face turned towards the indifferent blue sky, the other's chest hitched, a small, futile movement. They were so young, their faces covered in the fuzz of boys who had not yet had to shave many times. They had died for a liar's greed, for a handful of promised coins. A wave of profound, aching sorrow washed over her, a grief so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Taji slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet. He limped to the doorway and stood for a long moment, looking out at the bodies. He was not looking at enemies. He was looking at the dead. He went back to their small pack and took out a handful of dried pine needles and a single, fragrant sprig of sage. He built a tiny, careful fire just outside the mission walls, a fire not for warmth, but for a purpose. As a thin, clean line of smoke began to rise into the still air, he knelt before it. He began to speak in his own language, his voice a low, rhythmic chant that was both a prayer and a lament. He was not speaking to a distant god in the sky. He was speaking to the smoke, to the wind, to the spirits of the men whose journey had ended so violently in this place. Eliza stood a respectful distance away, an observer to a ritual whose words she did not know, but whose meaning she understood in her very soul. He was offering a path, a kind of peace, to the souls of the men who had tried to kill him. When he finally fell silent, he remained kneeling for a long time, his head bowed. Why, Eliza asked, her voice barely a whisper, after what they did. Taji did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the rising smoke, as if he could see his words traveling upon it. "Hunger makes a man a wolf," he said, his voice rough with a sorrow that seemed to encompass more than just the two bodies lying in the dirt. Hunger for food, for gold, for a life that is not so hard. He finally turned his head, and his dark eyes met hers. Their hunger is over. Their spirits should not have to wander this place still searching. There was no more to be said. The task that remained was a grim, final act of humanity. They found a spot near a small stream where the ground was softer, fed by the slow melt of the ice higher up. There was no shovel. Tazi used his knife to cut into the rocky soil, and they used flat stones and their bare hands to scoop out the earth. The work was slow and agonizing. The red iron-rich soil was cold and damp, packing under their fingernails, staining their hands a deep, rusty brown. The sharp edges of the stones cut and scraped their palms, but they worked on in a shared, dogged silence. The physical labor was a balm, a way to sweat out the poison of the last few hours, to transform the violent energy of the fight into something tangible, something that felt, in its own strange way, like healing. They dug 2 shallow graves, side by side. Together, they carried the bodies and laid them gently in the earth. There were no prayers said in English, no final words spoken. The only sound was the murmur of the stream and their own ragged breathing. As Taji began to push the earth back into the graves, Eliza stopped him. She reached into the small satchel where she kept the salvaged remains of her art supplies. She took out a single, perfect stick of soft, black charcoal. She knelt by the first grave and gently placed the charcoal on the chest of the boy who lay within. "For the stories you won't get to tell," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. It was an artist's tribute, the only offering she could make. She was giving him back a voice, a tool to draw his own map in the next world. When the graves were filled, they were just 2 stark, red mounds on the landscape. Tazi found a flat, gray river stone for each one. He did not try to carve their names. He did not know them. Instead, with the tip of his bone knife, he etched a small, simple symbol into the surface of each stone. It was not a cross, not a name, but a spiral with an arrow pointing away from its center. "What is it?" Eliza asked softly. "The wind changing direction," he said. It was a prayer for a new journey, a hope that their spirits, released from the trap of their violent lives, might find a different path. They stood before the finished graves as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose. The fierce wind that had scoured the Mogollon Rim for weeks had finally died. A profound stillness had fallen over the high country. In the silence, a new sound began to assert itself, the clear, musical sound of running water, growing louder and more confident as the winter's ice surrendered its grip to the coming spring. The season was turning, a life, an age was ending, and a new one was beginning. They walked back to the mission in silence, the weight of the day settling upon them. In the soft, golden light of evening, the old adobe walls seemed to glow, a warm, honeyed color. It was a place of peace now, its ghosts laid to rest. They stood in the doorway, looking out at the vast, darkening landscape. Below them, the world fell away into a deep blue sea of shadows. Above, the first stars were beginning to prick the velvet sky. The path down to Copper Vale, to the world of men and towns and posted rewards, was there. And the path back up, into the heart of the silent, waiting mountains, was there as well. They were standing on the precipice of a choice. Eliza was the one who finally gave it a voice, her question so quiet it was almost a thought. "Do we go down, or do we stay?" Taji was silent for a long time, his profile a stark, beautiful silhouette against the fading light. He was looking down at the world of Marlowe Pike, a world that had taken everything from him. And he was looking at the woman standing beside him, the woman who had, in her own way, given him something back. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of the truth he had to offer her. It was not an easy truth. "The mountain keeps everything," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is a hard place. It will keep the memory of this day. It will keep the cold and the hunger." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and serious, holding nothing back. "And it will keep the moments of warmth. It keeps love and it keeps loss. Both. Always. He was not offering her a promise of happiness. He was offering her a promise of reality, a life of profound beauty and profound sorrow, woven together so tightly they could not be separated. He was giving her the dignity of an honest choice. Eliza looked from his face to the vast, wild expanse of the mountains, a landscape that was no longer an enemy, but a teacher. It had stripped her of everything she thought she was, and in doing so, had shown her who she could be. She thought of the drawing rooms of Philadelphia, of a life of polite fictions and stolen funds, and she thought of the absolute, undeniable truth of this man, of the feel of his wrist in her hand, of the shared fight for survival, of the quiet dignity of digging a grave for an enemy. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she could never go back. The story she wanted to live was not written down in the flatlands. It was written here, in the stone and the wind and the changing of the seasons. She turned to face him. Her decision made, she looked into his eyes and gave him her own truth, the simplest and most profound one she had ever known. "I choose this mountain," she said softly. And then, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she added the words that changed everything. "And I choose you." The morning after was born in silence and light. Tazi woke her not with a touch, but by simply being gone. When Eliza opened her eyes, the space in the old mission where he had slept was empty. For a fleeting, panicked moment, she thought he had left, that her words had been too much, a chain he was unwilling to wear. But then she saw the small pile of fresh, dry kindling by the cold ashes of their fire, and a water skin, full and cool, placed beside her. He had not left her. He was simply letting her wake to the new world on her own. She rose and went to the broken doorway. The air was different. The sharp, sterile bite of the deep cold was gone, replaced by a soft, damp breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and pine. The world, which had been a stark study in black rock and white snow, was now infused with the faintest hints of color. He was waiting for her outside. He stood on a high promontory of rock that overlooked the entire canyon, a place they had not yet been. When he saw her, he beckoned with a slight movement of his head. She followed, and he led her up a narrow, winding path to the summit of the rock. The view stole her breath. Below them, the canyon was transformed. The great white blanket of snow was in full retreat, shrinking back to the highest, most shadowed crevices. In its place, covering the canyon floor and the lower slopes, was a tentative, impossible green. The first new shoots of grass, a delicate, vibrant fuzz that was a promise of life reborn. The stream that had been a muddy, angry torrent, and then a frozen, silent snake was now a celebration. It was a wide, clear ribbon of silver, chuckling and singing as it danced over the rocks, its voice the dominant sound in the quiet morning. The world was washing itself clean. Taji stood beside her, his presence a quiet, solid comfort. He was not looking at the grand vista, but at a wide, flat slab of sandstone at their feet, its surface warmed by the morning sun. Without a word, he drew his bone knife. Its edge was still sharp, its point fine. He knelt, and with slow, deliberate strokes, he began to carve into the soft surface of the stone. He was not a man of words, and he was not an artist in her sense of the word. His lines were not meant to capture beauty, but meaning. He carved a small, simple shape, a circle for the center, and 5 simple, rounded petals radiating from it. It was a wildflower, the kind that blooms in the harshest of places, its roots clinging to the thin soil in the cracks of rocks. It was a symbol of resilience, of a stubborn and improbable life. It was a mark, a record. This was the day. This was the place where they had ceased to be two separate, desperate survivors and had become something else entirely. The day they were no longer alone. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, his work complete. He had made his statement, a permanent promise etched in stone. Eliza's heart was so full she thought it might break. She understood the gift she had been given, the depth of the sentiment expressed in that one simple image. She knelt beside him and opened her satchel, taking out her piece of charcoal. Her own hands, she noted, were no longer the soft, unblemished hands of a painter. They were scratched and calloused, her nails broken, stained with dirt and blood and smoke. They were the hands of a woman who had clawed her way back to life. They were hands that knew the texture of stone and the weight of a rifle. She looked at his carving, and then she looked at the distant line of the mountains, a soft, undulating curve against the morning sky. She began to draw on the stone beside his flower. She did not draw his face. A promise was a promise, and this one was sacred. But she drew the path they had taken, not the frantic, zigzagging scramble of their escape, but a gentle, winding trail that led up from the canyon floor and into the high, hopeful peaks. It was a soft line, a line of possibility. "I will not draw your face," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion as her fingers moved across the stone. "But I will draw our path, the one we walked together." He watched her, his dark eyes seeming to absorb the meaning of her lines, the way her charcoal trail flowed from the base of his rock flower and into the future. It was a merging of their languages, his symbol of the present moment, hers of the journey to come. Two promises, side by side, forever bound together in the warm, living stone. They left the carvings to the sun and the sky and made their way back down. They did not return to the mission. Its purpose was served. It was a place of ghosts, and their life was for the living. They walked the long miles back to the first cave, the place where he had dragged her, half drowned, from the flood. It was no longer a dark, desperate shelter. It was home. The afternoon sun filled its mouth with a warm, welcoming light. They fell into the easy, unspoken rhythm of a shared life. Taji used his knife to strip a young pine, using the flexible branches to patch the crude roof of the lean-to he had built against the back wall, making it stronger, more permanent. Eliza took the snares she had learned to make and set them along the game trails, her movements now confident and sure. They hung the last of the wolf meat to cure, its smoky, savory scent filling the air. It was the rhythm of a normal day, but it was a rhythm they had built together, a foundation laid stone by stone, act by act, and because of that, it was more solid, more enduring than any life she had ever known. That night, the fire seemed to burn brighter, its warmth reaching deeper into their bones. The straight, true column of smoke rising from their fire was no longer a signal to be feared, but a declaration. "We are here. We remain." Taji took a final, fragrant bough of pine and placed it on the embers. The smoke billowed up, thick and white, carrying the scent of the living mountain. He knelt and began his low, quiet prayer. He spoke for the boys in their shallow graves, for the life that had been violently torn from them, and he spoke for the two of them, for the life that remained, for the new path they had chosen. Eliza sat across the fire from him, the flames dancing in her eyes. She did not feel like an intruder now. She felt like a part of the ritual. The smoke was no longer a mystery, its language no longer foreign. It spoke of sorrow and of gratitude, of endings and of beginnings. "I can hear the words now," she whispered, so softly that the fire almost swallowed the sound. "I can hear them in the smoke." He looked up at her, and in the warm, flickering light, she saw his eyes, and in their depths was a universe of understanding, a peace that passed all words. Far below, in the towns and settlements of the flatlands, the notice for the missing painter from the east would already be curling at the edges, gathering dust. The story would fade, replaced by new tales of silver strikes and railroad feuds. The reward would go unclaimed, the memory of Eliza Calder dissolving into a footnote in the territory's long and bloody history. The world of men had its stories, loud and temporary. But up here, in the high, silent mountains, a different story was being written, a story not on paper, but in stone, a story not of reward, but of choice, a choice made not with promises and contracts, but with a shared meal and a tended wound, a choice that was hot and real and alive. The night wind began to rise, but it was not the old wind. the thief that came with a blade to steal a man's warmth. This was a new wind, the soft breath of the coming spring. It moved through the pines with a gentle sigh and curled into the mouth of the cave. It felt not like a knife, but like a cool, gentle hand, stroking the smoke from their hair, bathing their tired faces. The fire burned down to a soft, pulsing heart of embers. The prayer was finished. The day was done. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to promise. The words had all been spoken, in deeds, in silence, in charcoal, and in stone. Taji reached a hand across the warm space between them. Eliza took it. His hand was hard and calloused, a map of the difficult life he had lived. Hers was scarred and strong, a testament to the life she had found. Their fingers interlaced, a quiet, perfect fit. Together, they sat in the warm, breathing darkness of their home and watched the last of the winter's ice being carried away on the singing waters of the stream. Two solitary figures holding back the night and holding on to each other. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to give it an extra boost, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.